Hey, I'm Mike Farrington. Welcome back to the boardroom. In this video, I'm going to build an entry door. Please note the jamb, side lights, installation, all that other stuff will be in a future video. So in this video, we're just going to focus on how to make a professional quality door. Before going any farther, I'd like to clear up some confusion before it even starts. I'm building two doors in this video, one for a customer and one for my own home. The customer project is white oak, the door for my compound is cherry. So if you see two different materials being used, that's why. When I was commissioned to build the door, I thought it would be efficient to go ahead and build a second one that I could later install on my house. Step one is to build cores that will eventually become the rails and stiles. This is eastern white pine, which is a wood that does fairly well outdoors. It's also light. Were I to build a 2-inch door from solid white oak, it would be comically heavy. So a pine core helps keep down the weight. And what I'm doing is I'm ripping strips from a flat sawn board, flipping them up on edge and gluing them into a sandwich. This creates a quarter sawn core, and because there are several pieces that make up the core, each one is being held in place by the other. Stability is gained because it's very unlikely one piece will be strong enough to cause the glue up to warp. If this seems like a lot of work, it is. I believe it's worth the effort though. In my climate, this door will be exposed to a range of humidities and maybe as much as 130-degree difference between summer and winter. Summer highs are usually in the low 100s. Winter lows get to -20 or more. And when it's -20 outside, the inside of the door will see 65-ish degrees. This wreaks havoc on wood. So the payoff here is a door that won't warp or crack for its entire life. This is a moisture meter. It shows how much moisture is contained in wood. When gluing up the cores, I'm using Titebond 3, which is water-based glue. So after glue up, as expected, moisture has crept up. I let the cores sit as many days as needed until they're back down to a good workable number, which is somewhere between 6 and 8% for my climate. As I'm moving from core to core, these were glued up over the course of a few days, which is why the numbers vary so much. At this point, the cores have had a few days to rest, but perfect moisture content is not needed for the next step. I start by jointing off most of the glue. This is just to make the pieces easier to handle for the next step. Okay, so the next step is to add some edge banding. If you're wondering why I didn't do this during the last step, well, I had ordered some lumber and it hadn't come in yet. So it would have been smarter to do this when making the cores originally. Yes, it's not possible to have too many clamps. Now the cores are properly dried and checked with a moisture meter. Any movement that was going to occur after gluing theoretically should have already occurred. So that means it's time to bust out the A game. I worked to the very best of my abilities to joint these pieces perfectly. If you see 2 layers of edge banding, I was working through my old stash of pine when making the cores. I ran a little low, so some pieces got 2 layers of edge banding to build up the proper width. After one side is dialed in flat, I plane to slightly over final thickness. Always great to have the shop apprentice assisting. He's taking the bus home from school these days. He likes to come in and check on me after school to make sure I'm not slacking off. After planing, I use the mighty, terrifying radial arm saw to clean up the ends. Maybe time for a joke. Bacon and veneer are both better when thick cut. This is 3/16 inch thick veneer. I'm edge gluing it to build up width, and I added as many cuts to this scene as was humanly possible. Pro tip. I picked this great tip up from furniture maker Christian Bexford. Write down the freaking time on your glue ups. That way, you know when you can take them out of the clamps. The real question is, how in the HE double hockey sticks did I not come up with this on my own? Finding an area on a board that's 6 inches wide and 7 feet long and perfectly clear is not easy. This is one of the challenges of door building. Time to saw some veneers. I install a high fence and confirm that it's square. I like to use a carbide blade. While not cheap, these things cut veneer like it's their job. This is a task where I'd like to add a power feeder sometime in the future. This would make the task easier and give me better results. The long, stringy structure of white oak sure makes for nice splinters. Let's have a look at the cherry veneers for my door. I just couldn't find perfectly clear pieces. No problem, let's fix them up a little bit. CA glue and some clamps will shrink the crack down. Later I'll add some epoxy with black dye and fill in the knot hole. Next I found 2 pieces had some checking. This was only visible after sawing the veneers. For this I smear some wood glue in the crack and clamp it together. This ended up working flawlessly. I mentioned earlier that I had cut my veneers to 3/16 of an inch. My target's actually a heavy 1/8 of an inch, so a couple passes through my glorious wide belt sander will bring them down to thickness. I'm running a 60 grit belt, which cuts fast, but more importantly, the instructions for the glue I'm going to use say to sand surfaces to 60 grit. After sanding, my repair work looked nearly invisible. Final preparations before gluing the veneers to the cores. I set each piece on this beam that I made. It's constructed from LVL lumber, same as my bench top, but it's been checked with a reliable straight edge. I use this as a reference surface. I make some marks as needed, and I have one last opportunity to joint and plane these things and make sure they're nice and flat. Thicker veneers can be worked just like normal lumber. I cut these maybe a 1/16 inch wider than the cores, so I have a little wiggle room when gluing. More 60 grit sanding. The heavy grit gives tooth for the epoxy to grab onto. Speaking of epoxy, I'm using Total Boat. They're not a sponsor, and I even paid my own money for this glue. Anyway, let's mix some up. This is the slow setting stuff, so I can work at a comfortable pace. And besides, I don't even have the necessary equipment to run around with my hair on fire. I roll out an even coat on the core, lay down the veneer, flip it over, do the same thing. The blue tape is to keep the veneer in place. The plastic wrap is to keep the epoxy off my vacuum bag. This topper is called Homosote. It's sold in the drywall section of Home Depot. It's normally used for sound deadening. I cut it to size, knock off the corners. This is to prevent any sharp corners from poking my bag. Also, it's breathable, which helps spread out the clamping forces evenly. I leave these in the vac bag overnight. I like to make a platen with some grooves in it. This will give me a place to put the port. Without this, it can be a struggle as the port can suck itself shut. And here's a quick look at my vac pump. Felt like the video was missing something if I didn't show this. Vac bags don't work without a pump. And because it's cold in my shop, I also add a heated blanket to help along the exothermic reaction of the epoxy. If it's cold though, this helps with all glue types. An even layer of glue is important. How much to put down? That does require some experience, but I would describe it as if you were painting a wall, as much as you could roll on without it dripping. I have stacked 2 stiles onto the beam I showed earlier. With longer work pieces, it's possible to clamp them in a bowed position. By clamping them to the beam, I'm upping my chances that they stay perfectly flat. Alright, so at this point I have all the parts needed to build both doors. So I clean them up a little bit and prep them for joinery. The groove is the starting point. This is roughly 5/8 of an inch wide and 3/4 of an inch deep. I say roughly because the 5/8 inch dimension is sized to equal the 5/8 inch chisel on my hollow chisel mortiser. This will make more sense as the video unfurls. I do this in 2 passes in an attempt to minimize blowout. First pass is about 1/4 of an inch deep. For the second pass, I remove my plywood shim and do it all over again. Total non sequitur, but normally I'm a used tool kind of guy. With this shaper, I wanted both a sliding table and a tilting arbor, and I wanted the arbor to tilt away from the user. That left me with only one reasonable option, this Felder shaper. It has a few flaws, like the digital up and down is way too fast, for one, but overall it's a joy to use, and for making doors and larger projects, it's a great addition to my shop. If you don't have a shaper in your shop, that's okay. Everything I do in this video can be done on a table saw and router table. It's just not quite as fast. After cutting parts to length, it's time to make some tenons. Normally I don't blather on about the importance of the strength of joinery for a particular project. After all, I'm the guy who builds interior doors with biscuits. However, temperature and humidity swings beat up an exterior door. This is one area where traditional mortise and tenons are absolutely needed. This is to fight off sagging for as many years as possible. Back to the shaper. This is a special cutter that has a flush top. It actually bolts down to the top of the spindle. This allows for a longer tenon to be cut. In this case, 3 3/4 inch long tenons. Here's where a sliding table really helps the process along. I've done my fair share of tenoning at the table saw. This is just so much fun to cut tenons with this tool. For the bottom rail, it's a good idea to break up the tenon into 2 sections. This is to reduce cross-grain expansion and contraction issues. So after laying out the tenons, I use those same marks to lay out for the mortises. I feel like more marking is better than less marking. After all this work, it would be a bummer to cut one of these wrong. Hollow chisels need sharpening on occasion. I buff all 4 sides on a diamond plate. I clean the inside with a special sharpening cone, and finally I touch up the drill bit at the bench grinder. I have a video on my channel somewhere showing how I restored this hollow chisel mortiser if you're interested. So the groove cut was sized to match this chisel. This is so the stub portion of the tenon and the longer portion of the tenon could be cut to the same size. Plus it makes setup super easy. It's kind of difficult to get good action shots of these mortises being cut. One thing to note though, I cut a little past my layout lines, so I have some wiggle room. With the mortises done, I use a combination of the bandsaw and the table saw to cut the tenon haunches. These first few cuts don't need to be crazy accurate, so I just work up to my pencil lines. For this baseline cut, I eyeball the fence setting. I run the ends of the tenons against the fence. I make a cut, I flip the rail over, and cut the other direction. This haunch cut is the only one where some accuracy is needed. This would show when looking at the top or bottom of the door. Not a big deal, but for me I just want this to be close enough so there isn't a gap where stuff could fall in. At this point, the mortise and tenons are done, so I turn my attention to the middle portion of the door. Each door will have 2 mullions and 3 panels in the lower section. After cutting to length, I move on to more tenon cutting. These are just little stubby guys, they don't add structure, just to hold these mullions in place. I reinstall the same groover stack from earlier. I set the height by matching it to the tenon. This setting is different from the one I used for the rails and stiles, as this part is a little thinner. Same as before, I complete the cut in 2 passes. I break out the mighty double taper sanding disc to clean up the inside edges of all parts prior to glue up. Sanding edges of parts after a project has been glued together is essentially impossible, so best done beforehand. Future me would like to go back in time and remind me to open the table saw blast gate, as that would greatly improve dust collection. If you'd like one of these discs for your shop, visit mikefrankson.com or check the link below. Pro tip, if you're cutting a tongue, have the tongue below the cutter. This will ensure that the tongue comes out consistent and correct, even if the workpiece varies in thickness. Same principle can be applied to the table saw or the router table or many other tools. 2 for Tuesday pro tip. When cutting a raised panel, cut across the grain first, then cut with the grain. Cutting with the grain will remove any blowout caused by cutting across it. The 3 panels and 2 mullions are done and have been set aside. Now it's time to work on the grid for the windows. This is one area where I break from tradition. While I could make 6 individual windows, that would be more traditional. Modern building code requires dual pane insulated glass. So I think it's a better compromise to have the grid on the outside and 1 single window pane behind that grid. It's significantly cheaper to do it this way, and it's better insulated. Back to the mortiser, this time with a 1/4 inch bit. Here's another area where I make sure I have my parts oriented correctly and also marked clearly. Tenons for the grid work are done at the table saw, as are the lap joints. Seeing all this come together is really neat. For a good portion of this project, it's just making parts. So seeing the test fit come together makes it feel like a real project. More slow set epoxy for the glue up. It's great being able to really take my time. It's such a stress reducer. I also think epoxy is the best choice for projects that will be exposed to the elements. And this is also a really good shot of how the joinery all comes together. You got the twin tenons at the bottom, the 3 floating panels, the 2 mullions, the mid rail, the grid work. All of it comes together to make a beautiful door. Another benefit of epoxy is it doesn't cause the wood to swell, and it adds a little bit of lubricity, so parts tend to slide together really nicely. Really, the only downside is having to mix it and the cost. So I add a little blue tape to the joints to keep the door from adhering to my workbench, and when clamping, I use only enough pressure to close the joints. I find it odd that some woodworkers look down on the mighty pipe clamp. They have pros and cons just like everything else. I will say they are the most cost effective when a super long clamp is needed. Alright, the next tedious task is to make the shelf that goes below the window. I start by cutting a parallelogram. Parallelograms don't mesh too well with the Festool domino, so my solution is to clamp the workpiece to the bench top and then use the bench top as a reference surface. I add a shim below the domino to lift up the mortise a little. And same deal with the dental pieces. This technique yields parts that have odd angles but still come together nicely. Now it's time to attach the shelf to the door. I clamp a fence in place. I have some tick marks so I know where to drill. Once the door's been drilled, I use the same fence to lift up the domino. This will ensure that the bottom of the window and the top of the shelf are flush. The only wacky part is I needed to tilt the domino up so it's pressed against the back of the shelf. That's a little too freestyle for my liking, but it ended up working out fine. Shazam! Have a look at that. Now it's a proper arts and crafts style door. Type bond 3 for this glue up. It's non-structural, so I don't feel epoxy is needed. Alright, one final operation here. I need to make this groove a rabbet so the glass can be installed. I do this with a bottom bearing bit. It's a bit messy, but it works great. And I square the corners later with a chisel. And of course, after the glass is installed, a small molding will be installed in this area to clean up the look and hold the glass in place. But that's for the next video. Okay, here's the current state of the project. The building is basically done. Lots of detail work still left to do, all of which will be covered in the next episode. I really like the results so far. The dental shelf, the slightly raised panel all add subtle bits of interest. Door making really is great fun, making accurate parts, big mortise and tenons, plus the fact that people will interact with it daily really make for an exciting project. Why don't we close out with a couple finished shots of the customer's door? Turned out pretty nice. Okay, thank you for watching. Till next time.